You're listening to The Charity Show, the podcast for charity insiders by charity insiders. If you enjoy the show, please take a second to rate, follow and subscribe on your usual podcast platform. And here's what's coming up in episode 24. The world is unforgiving now if you get things wrong. As an individual, if you post something stupid online, you will get called out and cancelled, as we see repeatedly time and time again. But it's the same as an organisation, whether or not you're a corporate or a charity. I think if you get something wrong these days, you know, your peers will call you out.
Charities, they don't need to hire a photographer like me. It's actually better in many cases for a charity to do it themselves because they've got people there on the ground. And just having a little bit of training and guidance on how to actually turn a moment that's going to happen anyway into a moment that's going to happen, plus a story that you can tell on different platforms, in different formats, in different ways, to create that authentic connection between the work of the charity and the individuals and the person who's viewing it.
Charities are aware that there's this shift towards secondhand clothes sales through apps like Vinted, but rather than kind of trying to fight them, they're partnering with them. So Vinted and Depop are also welcoming that and embracing that and inviting and helping charities to do so. So this could well be the future.
Just wonderful to be able to highlight some of the smaller charities. We know them, the grassroots, the ones that are down your local town, your local area. There's so many of them up and down the country. And this is from Rachel from charity Open Country, who got in touch this week to tell us about the charity she works for. Welcome back to The Charity Show. I'm Piers Townley, PR Manager at the Brain Tumour Charity.
And I'm Tim Beynon, Head of Marketing Engagement at Firefighters Charity. And this week, Piers, we're going to be taking a look at charities' use of imagery. And we're going to be asking whether the images we choose to use in our campaigns might actually be doing more harm than good. Our guest today is Matt Mahmood-Ogston. He's a charity CEO and a photographer who has written a fascinating piece on LinkedIn that I spotted and which triggered this interview, really, titled The Uncomfortable Truth About Your Charity Photos. So I highly recommend everybody looks that up on LinkedIn. It's a fascinating read. So we're going to talk to Matt and we're going to dive into the world of cliched imagery and storytelling, picking up on some of those themes around service users being victims and charities as saviours. And we're going to explore what options and ethics we should be considering when we're choosing our images and we're choosing what stories to tell. So I'm fascinated by this, Piers. It takes me back to my university days when I remember doing a fair bit on ethics in my journalism course back in the day. But I think it's fair to say the world's changed a fair bit, especially in recent years, in terms of what is and isn't acceptable. Bit different from our days in the past in the press rooms we probably worked in. What do you reckon, Piers?
Yeah, very much so, very much so. And I think it's something that, well, I've seen our organisation, I've seen our charity had to change. We went through a rebrand a few years back, and then we went through a kind of audit, if you like. I think a lot of organisations, a lot of third sector organisations done that kind of image and copy audit and see if they're actually, you know, serving and doing the due diligence and due respect to the audiences that they serve. We've definitely had to do it at the Brain Tumour Charity. And there are some other great examples out there as well, too. Just recently on my doorstep, I had a direct marketing thing from Médecins Sans Frontières, and they've explored and they continue to do it really, really well, obviously by the nature of the work that they do around the world. But a lot of theirs is kind of very much reportage kind of imagery and, you know, that kind of documentary style, not necessarily raw, but obviously showing the, you know, the everyday, the storytelling aspects of the work they do. And I just remember seeing their brochure that came out. It was a gatefold, it opened, then it opened up again. It had the snapshots from their work all over the world. But the imagery was very, very engaging. It's that cliche of a picture telling 1,000 words. It was just something that stood out with me. And, you know, their latest campaign, as ever, is always a good example.
Yeah, bang on. They're a good example. And I think that whole reportage style, we talk about it with Matt in the interview shortly, but it is interesting how that seems to be taking precedence and be seen more now than that kind of posed, constructed photography and imagery that maybe is now getting a little dated, and maybe that's something that has seen its time, and we're moving on from then. Maybe that's driven by some of the sort of social media trends and some of the stuff that's going on in society at the moment. And I think if you look at that as a whole, it is a fascinating conversation to be had in wider terms about society as a whole, in terms of how things have changed over recent years. And I think you look back, and I think we've been around a fair bit, you look back on, say, the last 25 years and how things have changed. things like the lads mags that were mainstream back in the early 1990s and early 2000s, Page 3 and all of that. It's all consigned to history now. It doesn't exist.
Very much
We've moved
so.
On since then.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think the point, I think Matt touches on this later on in the conversation that we have with them as well, is that people and, younger generations, they are image savvy because they're curating their own publishing at the moment, aren't they? So they can spot if an image is authentic or staged. I think people are demanding a little bit more. And then, to the further extreme, we got, well, what's the advent of AI going to do to these images and to this kind of branding as well? So it's kind of finding that marriage in between that obviously Matt touches on, that you need for that authenticity, that honesty in what you're doing as a cause.
Yeah, I think authenticity and honesty is something that AI is going to, or the use of AI is going to have us questioning images all the time. What is real these days? What isn't real? That is a whole nother subject. But yeah, you're absolutely right. And I think it is interesting to look at how images and things have changed. Things like body image and mental health and disability, how they're portrayed in imagery, and that kind of storytelling. It is changing. And I think it's driven a lot by social media. And I think we probably live in, I don't know if I'm wrong in saying it really, but it is a bit of we live in a sort of ferocious cancel culture now, don't you think? Do you think if you get something wrong now, you get called out on it? Fair to say?
Yeah, I think people's barriers are up, aren't they? People's radar is up. So if you're not having that directly affecting you as an organisation or as a brand, you are very aware of it. So it's almost a kind of sitting in the background, a neurosis about when you're putting together comms or putting together some multimedia, putting together some content. You are thinking, well, actually, this checklist, this mental checklist has to be added to the checklist that traditionally you've always had in terms of, what you're putting out there as an organisation.
Yeah, because I think the world is unforgiving now if you get things wrong. As an individual, if you post something stupid online, you will get called out and cancelled, as we see repeatedly time and time again. But it's the same as an organisation, whether or not you're a corporate or a charity. I think if you get something wrong these days, your peers will call you out. And well,
you can see it, can't you?
Rightly so.
Yeah, you can see it in the news. There's been a few cases fairly recently, isn't there, where the charities and a few politicians come out and saying, or feeding a kind of media frenzy. I think there's a big one about over-diagnosing mental health, for example. But the speed at which the backlash, or the speed at which the comms departments of various charities associated with causes to do with that have to then respond and ride that wave of kind of backlash over on social media. Yeah, it's frighteningly fast, you're right.
Yeah, and the implications are significant. If you do get something wrong and you do get called out and cancelled or whatever, you could lose donors, you could lose supporters, you could lose corporate backing, you could lose whatever. So there's high risks there. So yeah, it's a really fascinating conversation, a really, really exciting one to be having, I think, and really important for charities big and small to be considering. So we'll dive into that with Matt shortly. But before we do, Piers, how was your Easter? Got to look back on the Easter weekend. Did you have a good one?
Had a great one, but it just feels like such a long time ago, which kind of just emphasizes the fast-paced nature of what we do, the fast-paced nature of day-to-day life at the moment, isn't it? Yeah, it's gone in the blink of an eye, although we do have a garage full of chocolate Easter eggs that are being tentatively pretending to be hidden away so we're not tempted, but sit down with the kids and there's just chomping our way through those almost to the point where I'll be glad when they've all been eaten. But
yeah. It's always daunting having all that chocolate. You just got to get rid of it. I mean, just get rid of it.
Feels like a challenge event in itself. Sponsor me to finish my Easter eggs.
I know our kids are a bit older now, but did you do them? And was there an Easter egg hunt in the garden?
There was, and my sister's, yeah. But we've got a dog now, so the dog got involved as well. So everyone's panicking then, because obviously dogs and chocolate are not a great mix. So it wasn't quite the calm, kiddie one that we used to have in years gone by.
No, nice. Love it. On today's episode of The Charity Show, we're joined by Matt Mahmood-Ogston, photographer, campaigner, and founder of the Naz and Matt Foundation, for a powerful two-part conversation all about photography and imagery and storytelling in the charity sector. In part one, Matt reflects on his personal journey and sets out why the way charities capture and share images needs to evolve, moving away from glossy, staged content to something more honest, ethical, and human. He explains how the right image can build trust, tell deeper truths, and avoid harm, especially when working with vulnerable communities. We'll then take a pause for a quick roundup of the latest third sector news before diving into part two, where Matt shares practical ways charities can shift their approach, examples of organisations getting it right, and what truly authentic storytelling looks like in action. Matt, welcome to the Charity Show. Fantastic to see you. Really lovely to have you on as a guest today. We're here to talk about photography and all things imagery in regards to the sector and how charities can evolve and change the way they use photography. But before we dive into that topic, can you tell us a little bit perhaps about your background and what led you to focus on ethical storytelling in the sector?
Thank you. I mean, first of all, thank you for inviting me on the show today. I really appreciate it. So my background, I kind of did a 2-year diploma in photography many years ago. I later worked at Magnum Photos. Many of you probably know Magnum Photos. And just being surrounded by some of the world's best documentary photographers, that was really kind of my crash course into the real importance and the real value that social impact photography or documentary photography, more widely named, can actually have on communities. But it wasn't really until I worked in web development, user experience design for quite some time. So I spent a lot of time understanding how people behave, particularly to websites or apps. And then sadly in 2014, and trigger warning for anyone listening, sadly in 2014, my fiance of 13 years, Naz, sadly he took his own life 2 days after being confronted about his sexuality for the first time by his parents. And that event, it nearly destroyed me, and it kind of led me on to create and launch Naz and Matt Foundation, which is a charity that works with vulnerable LGBTQI individuals from religious and culturally conservative backgrounds. And we work to support those individuals, many of who are experiencing death threats from their own family, or have had to flee their country of birth because their own government or the police and their family want to kill them just because of the way that they're born. And so as the kind of the charity developed, I was invited more and more to share our story. And by sharing our story on, big platforms like the BBC, Sky News, Public Talks, I'm making it sound quite easy, but it was a really difficult journey to be able to share, our story publicly. But what I began to see was that I was just sharing our story, but what I found was that the more I shared our story, the more people came to us either offering support or asking me for support. And that slowly developed into a support program where we provide frontline support to individuals in desperate need and urgent need of help. And really I've been doing this for like a decade now, and what it made me realize is that the real power of storytelling, and when you tell a story in a different audience in a different room, for example, if I'm sharing a story in a secondary school, it's still our story, but I have to share a very different version of the story, our story, compared to if I'm in a room full of frontline police officers or government officials. So it kind of, over that journey of trial and error and delivering around about 80 plus public talks and workshops, it really helps me understand the value of storytelling, even though in my mind that's not what I was calling it. I was just sharing our story. I didn't really objectively look at it as a storytelling process. I just realized that, okay, I need to share a hook at the beginning to get people on board and get them emotionally connected to what I'm doing. I need people to hear the detail of our story, and ultimately at the end I need to have them to take action after I've shared our story, because what a waste of time for myself and everyone in the room if all I did was go in the room and just talk for 20 minutes or an hour or whatever the period is. So that process kind of really helped me refine storytelling from a hands-on, practical perspective rather than a theoretical perspective. As the charity developed and we then started to need to look for funding, and we needed to tell our story to funders and the press even more, and when we got to producing our impact reports at the end of the year, because I'm a photographer, I've always been the photographer in our friend circle and our family, but it got to the end of the year around the reports, and you would think you would know better. I should know better being in that situation, but we'd get to the annual report and but where's the photographs? We don't have any photographs because we're working with very vulnerable individuals in communities, and it's not appropriate to photograph them or ask them to photographs. So it was frustration after a few years of not having the photos, or the photos that were taken by other people who were volunteering at the time. They were great and they were documenting the moments that happened. But I realized I wanted more than the photographs we had. And the more and more I looked at it, I realized, and the charities that I'd started to work with, I started to really understand that there's a big gap here. And all of those learnings from Magnum Photos and all the learnings from the storytelling, if I could just produce a service or platform that I needed myself and still need myself in my own charity work, then that's going to be useful to other people. Because the more charities I spoke to, I realized that if I'm trained in photography and I worked at one of these, this incredible agency, and if I can't produce these photographs, or I haven't produced these photographs, then individuals who have far less experience in this area, then how are they coping? What are they doing? And then I started a few years ago working, doing some freelance work for Old Diorama Art Centre in Camden. They asked me to photograph lots of community events, and I really saw how they were using their photographs that I took for them for their impact reports, for their websites, for their marketing, for their community building. And just over time, it kind of made me realize that there's a need out there, and there's a desperate need out there for really authentic storytelling that's not sensationalized, that's not done in a way that really takes advantage of vulnerable individuals when they come to the charities, but finding a way where there could be that safe space where individuals could be sharing their stories if they wanted to, if they're a service user, but also how do you celebrate the work of the individuals who are doing the work in the communities? In some communities, it's not appropriate to even engage with photography for the service users or the people who are experiencing the service and needing the services. But it's how do you then tell a story? So it really got me thinking about how we tell the stories of the people behind the charities. What actually goes into, if a charity distributing food to homeless individuals, what goes on behind the scenes? Because if I can find a way of telling those stories that connect to individuals, then it's going to really help with their fundraising, their impact, their reach. And I think that's kind of really the background and the journey that's kind of led me to really focus on specifically social impact, because I see it slightly different to documentary photography. I see it as almost like a subset of documentary photography where it's specifically looking at the impact or the social impact of work that's done in a way that actually is comfortable for both the charities and service users.
Sure. Gosh, what a journey you've been on. First of all, I mean, I'm so sorry for your loss, and what a, that's not something anybody should ever have to go through. I suppose incredibly though, that kind of puts you in a very unique position, doesn't it? Because you can see both sides of the world, if you like, and the fact that you've gone through that experience yourself and had to and wanted to share your story, and rightly so. And also being a photographer and being a charity CEO, it means that you have a foot in all those different camps, and it does give you that unique perspective on the sector and on storytelling and on photography. So you're uniquely qualified in a way to talk about this. Over the course of those years, has there or was there a moment, your story aside, has there been a moment in which you sort of experienced something or spotted something or seen another charity's approach that's really made you also sort of stop and think? And this moment and this example is one of the reasons why I think we need to change, why these things need to change. Has there been any moment like that stuck out for you over the recent years?
Yes, I think it's a really good question, because I think documentary... So there's a challenge with documentary photography versus the social impact photography. It's the documentary photography. Sometimes you have to focus on the suffering. You have to focus on what's happening on the ground. You have to focus, if there's a war photographer that goes out to document the impact of what's happening, there's from a journalistic perspective, from a newspaper perspective, from an online magazine perspective, there's a certain expectation for things the absolutely devastating suffering to be somehow documented and shown to the world, because in some ways that's what's necessary to bring the world to know about the horrific tragedies and atrocities that are happening around the world. With social impact work, it's I see as it's a slightly different perspective because it's about celebrating the positive moments. It's about bringing positivity to the work. It's about actually giving people hope rather than just the sadness that might have led them to the situation where they've needed to ask for help from a charity. I mean, I've seen corporate organizations who have done it wrong, where they've done their CSR work and they've gone out and they've taken the photographs. That might have hired like a commercial photographer to go out and do it. And although talented, the photographer, if they're not from the community, it takes a lot more effort for a commercial photographer to gain trust from the community because they'll be seeing it from a different perspective. And that's not to rubbish commercial photographers because I admire so many of them and I get a lot of my learnings and trainings from them. But what I mean is it's when you go on there, not above the community or coming from an outsider's perspective, looking down into the community, but if you're actually part of a community already where people can see your story and they could just Google your name and it's like everything's there. That's how I've been able to gain trust with individuals a lot quicker because it's like, well, just Google my name and you can see everything about me. If everything's on the table then. I do see commercial organizations getting it wrong where they're putting the hero they're putting their organization as the hero in this situation because they donated X amount of pounds or they've donated the time of X number of employees, that they are somehow the hero. And that for me, this comes off a little bit wrong sometimes. And it's not that you can't celebrate your support of these causes or you can't celebrate the work of your employees supporting these causes. It's not about that at all. It's just how you present the story and how you tell that story. So it's really just about perhaps changing the lens and the perspective for really the direction of how the story is being told because companies that donate money and companies that donate human time from their employees, it's so incredibly important. It's so vitally important. So it needs to be documented, but it needs to be done in such a way that respects ultimately the safety and vulnerability and the humanity of the individuals who are receiving the score at the end.
I think it's really powerful, Matt, what you've touched on there, the authenticity. I think it's increasingly been something that all third sector and all non-profits are having to address so that they've got that connection that makes them stand outside of this cookie cutter model. So do you think with the advent of social media, so with the advent of supporters actually becoming their own user-generated content, which has been a buzzword for so many long. Do you think this is also driving it then, that supporters and charities are seeing that actually the people that they are supporting are demanding this authenticity, and they know the difference actually these days because everyone's got an access to this kind of storytelling in a certain respect. So is it kind of being generated, do you think, by supporters themselves?
Yes, I think so. I think the kind of the popularity of user-generated content, I think it's led to an evolution in how people see content and how they believe content. And the influencers that are, many of them are regular people doing regular things on TikTok, for example. The production values on a typical TikTok video compared to a video that was produced by a corporate organization 5-10 years ago. I mean, 5-10 years ago it was about high quality, best cameras, drone shots, sweeping slow motion shots, commercial music, and that was the goal. That was the standard. If you can get it like that, you prove the value in the investment that you've been paid for to produce. And then you get the user-generated content come out and say, well, if you've got an iPhone or any type of smartphone that has a camera capability, then you can record the story. And then it became clear that people were believing influencers a lot because they were perceived as real people doing real things on the ground in real situations. So I think there's definitely been a massive evolution because of user-generated content, because of social media. And I think that's created a really amazing opportunity where charities, they don't need to hire a photographer like me. With the right tools and the right skills and the right perspective and the right training, it's actually better in many cases for a charity to do it themselves because they've got people there on the ground. And just having a little bit of training or guidance on how to actually turn a moment that's going to happen anyway into a moment that's going to happen plus a story that you can tell on different platforms, in different formats, in different ways, to create that authentic connection between the work of the charity and the individuals and the person who's viewing it, potentially a funder, potentially a donor, potentially a volunteer, potentially an employee. And I think things like platforms where you get celebrities all of a sudden, on a platform which I'm not going to mention by name. There's a short form platform that people have used for many years, and that kind of really helped popularize access to really prominent figures who perhaps would have been hidden behind a PR machine or a PR company or a management agency before then. So I think that all of these things connected together has created this environment where authenticity is super, super important. And that's kind of led to what I think the real need for authentic photography, where if it's too polished and too shiny, they look too perfect. Is that really what happened? I mean, people have become wise to, you see it on Instagram quite a lot, where you have, this is the reality of this location, this tourist location, and this is the Instagram version of that location. It has no people and it's blue skies and blue water. So I think people are getting wise, and I think that's a good thing, because it means then that it's really democratizing the ability for people to share their own stories in a way that is them.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, Matt. It's almost like collectively, charities and their supporters and everyone associated with them are wising up to the fact that actually they need that authenticity, because the old models don't work anymore. But despite that, you see it time and time again, especially with some of the big glossy productions. Why is it you think that some larger charities or charities in general are struggling to move away from that? And why are they still sticking with that, do you think? What are they struggling with, do you think?
I think there's many factors, but some of it really is around, I guess it's like trust in their ability to actually deliver something that is safe within the boundaries of their PR, boundaries. But it's like a habit. It's like if you've been doing it one way for literally forever, it's a difficult thing to be persuaded to come out of that way of doing things. I mean, if it's still working for them, why would you need to change from the corporate glossy perspective or image? But then I think it's because you see really good examples, for example, with like the co-op, the cooperative, the supermarket, for example. They're wonderful at documenting real authentic stories of people in the communities that their brands and their organisation really helps. I mean, that's a really good example of doing it right. And I wish more organisations would do it in that way, would actually learn from the co-op and how they do it. But I think a lot of it always comes down to fear, the fear of change and the fear of getting personal. It creates, or it can create, more risk. Because if you've got the polished PR machine version of a charity or a corporate organisation that's been sense checked, been censored even perhaps, approved by multiple levels of management and creatives and messaging experts and comms experts, after several layers of bureaucracy and approval, it's gone out. The risk is removed because 5 people might have approved that. But if it's an authentic story, and maybe that person whose story you're sharing, maybe they're mostly aligned to the brand, but maybe they do something that's not aligned to the brand, that's always a risk. What happens if you feature a real story of a real person who was in that moment, in the moment that should be documented for that story, but on social media they're perhaps completely.
Is there an issue there, Matt, as well, with the fact that charities, there's a certain formula that charities use, and you see it time and time again when telling stories. And even if they do, they do not go down the glossy high production route and they keep it simple, quite often you still see this traditional format, the traditional tearjerker where people are there could well be an authentic story, but the way it's told, the way it's structured, does mean the charity falls into, or the story or whatever, or the production or the video, whatever it is, does fall into that classic tale of before and after of victim and savior. You mentioned it in your article. Is that a sort of laziness that's out there, or is it just something that a formula that charities fall back into and that they struggle to break away from? Is there's something going on there that needs to fundamentally change in terms of how we tell stories?
It's It's very interesting what you're saying, because we do need to show the transformation, because if we can't show what life was like before the charities work and then what's life like after the charities work, if we can't show that, then that's a problem in itself. So we have to find creative ways of doing that, and it's really around positioning and perspective in the way that you tell that story. You know, when I share our story, as much as I try and escape not having to share our story, but you know, when I do an interview, you know, with BBC or these big channels, they always want the story in there, and it's about how do I give the news channel what they need, otherwise they won't cover the thing that we want them to talk about. But how do I take it away from just being in that place and being, it could be perceived as like a victim position where this happened to me and it's really sad and I want some kind of sympathy from people. It's not at all about that. It's about how can we bring some of the emotion from the reality of what the work is about, but then how can we take the conversation into a more positive place? Like, for example, more recently, my talks have been centering around hope, where hope can be used as a tool, right, to drive change. Now, we all know what hope means, but actually using it as a tool with an equation behind it in order to whether that's like a structure or a framework where we can use hope as a tool to create positive long-term change in communities. When we can use things like that within the story, then the focus it's less weighted towards before and after. But we have to do the transformation somewhere, but it's just how we present that transformation.
Really interesting stuff there with Matt. Makes you think back on all the campaigns we've seen over recent years, Tim. And we've got more from Matt coming up shortly. But before that, let's take a look at some third sector news. What's on your radar, Tim?
Okay, well, before I dive into my story, Piers, are you familiar with Vinted or Depop?
Vinted. Vinted is the curse of my frequent trips to the post office now, with my daughter selling an item of clothing for less than it costs to actually send it, and getting really annoyed then because she thinks she's undersold it. So a budding, failing and successful entrepreneur she's trying to be. But yeah, virtually anything clothing-wise that's not nailed down in our house gets put online at the moment. It's like ridiculous.
Yeah.
How about your two?
Yeah. Exactly the same. Well, it must be a daughter thing, I think. But my daughter's the same. She's sort of like got a big pile of stuff she wants to get rid of through Vinted. But that's a whole nother story. It links up nicely actually with this piece of news that I spotted this week. So, charity shops across the UK are increasingly turning, it says in the report I'm reading here, turning to online platforms in a bid to keep pace with the meteoric rise of these secondhand fashion apps such as Vinted and Depop. Because in-store sales are coming under pressure from rising costs and shifting consumer habits. So I thought this was a really interesting piece. And all this analysis from the Charity Retail Association reveals that while physical shop income declined throughout 2024, online sales rose by more than 10% in every quarter. As a result, 3/4 of charity retailers now sell online, which is a really surprising number. I didn't realize it was that high. A significant shift for a sector long reliant on bricks and mortar presence. So I think this is a really fascinating insight into how the charity shop world and charity retail is shifting into that online space. And it's interesting because it's apparent that it's not actually looking to compete with the likes of Vinted or Depop, but actually partner with them and take advantage of this new technology. So I think that's a really interesting thing to be aware of. And it says in this report, I'll just read a little bit further. Many charities have responded by embracing this digital shift. The British Heart Foundation, for example, has become the largest UK charity seller on eBay, with 2.5 million items sold and a following of nearly 330,000 users. It's also ramping up activity on Depop, which is an app just like Vinted, with more than 23,000 followers on there. And it sells specialist items such as defibrillators through its own online shop as well. So that's just one example. Oxfam's another example of a shop that's moving online. They operate around 500 shops nationwide, which we're all familiar with on our high streets. And it's also seen its online revenue soar recently. The charity's online shop itself generated over £10 million in the last financial year, And its Vinted store is among the first to take advantage of the platform's dedicated pro offering for charities. So I think this is really fascinating stuff because it just shows that charities are aware that then there's this shift towards secondhand clothes sales through apps like Vinted, increasingly so. But rather than kind of trying to fight them, they're partnering with them. So Vinted and Depop are also welcoming that and embracing that and inviting and helping charities to do so. So this could well be the future. And just one follow-up point on this story, actually, that I thought was really interesting. Perhaps something that you and I are seeing, Piers, in our own households, as we were just talking about. But interestingly as well, there seems to be there's been reported that there's a decline in the quality of physical sales, a decline in the quality of products that are being donated to charity shops. So what they're saying this is a result of is essentially the fact that people are now creating two piles of clothes at home when you're sorting through your clothes: your pile for the charity shop and your pile to sell on Vinted. And I think probably, I'll put my hands up. I think that's probably what happens in our house these days, especially my daughter when she's choosing stuff, what to sell. That does happen, and increasingly so. The result, unfortunately, for charity shops is that the lower quality stuff ends up either going to recycling or to the charity shops, and stuff that is more sellable ends up being sold on Vinted and so on. And I think also the rise of things like these locker systems like InPost and so on and so forth, which makes it much cheaper to actually post and mail these products, also, makes it more accessible and easier for people to sell on Vinted and the like as well. So it's booming. What do you think, Piers? Have you seen that?
Yeah, it's a huge shift, isn't it? I mean, it goes back to a lot of our guests talking about how to engage with the younger generation. So the partnerships you cited there, I mean, Oxfam maybe 10 million is a ridiculous amount of money, huge amount of money. But that engagement then is an example of actually acknowledging that generation, completely changing the way, the whole approach to, for example, charity, let alone just retail in itself. But you're right. So each household now is virtually its own charity shop. That's a really hard sell to a teenager to say, oh, all those clothes you don't want anymore, just give them away for free, or a little bit of online jiggery pokery and you can make yourself some money. How are you going to wrestle that is potentially huge, really.
Yeah, definitely, because and that also aligns with, I think, what we said in the last episode about the fact that young people are giving less to charity. That's being one of the reports that we cited, I think, in the last episode. And this could be one of the reasons for it. People are actually thinking more now. Well, it's I can make a bit of money, quick money out of these secondhand clothes apps and things. Why don't I? The people who suffer a result, the charity shops who are getting less of those clothes. So yeah, interesting insights, I think. What have you got, Piers, in the news?
Well, we can't go into this next episode and time of year without acknowledging what happened over the weekend, which was the most iconic of all of races. So huge it was. 56,000 plus runners running for hundreds and hundreds of different charities. Both of our charities also included in that, Tim, as well. But this is a really interesting story that's just come out in the last couple of days or last 24 hours or so. And it's quoted in the BBC that the London Marathon will no longer post on their X after its race director Hugh Brasher said the social media platform had ceased to be a positive place. And the feature goes on. So the race director Hugh doesn't mince his words at all. He goes on to say there are some social media channels that are particularly vitriolic and are descending into a gutter, he said. The decision he was referring to is off the back of just looking at the channel X and the vitriol. It was ceasing to be a rational conversation. It was ceasing to be a positive place to be. And this is a major thing. That's, we've seen this trickle that's becoming more of a tsunami of organisations and also charity, third sector organisations, taking their social comms away from X now. The London Marathon's official account, for example, has 191,000 followers. But it last posted officially on its channel on the 17th of January of this year. So no more X for the London Marathon. So we'll have to wait and see where they migrate to, whether that's a Threads or a Blue Sky or the next year or two. But I think it's something that we've talked about. We've had many guests on, talking about the comms teams of third sector and where they're going to take their engagement next.
I thought that was a really interesting timing from the marathon people and from the.
It was days before, wasn't it, or a day before?
Just a couple of days before the race, and they had great timing on their part for maximum exposure for that fact. So it is another. Could it be a nail in the coffin? Another nail in the coffin for X? I don't know, but more and more people are moving away.
Good bit of SEO there from that press team, I think, really. And then the other piece I'll zoom through is something that we talk about a lot. It's to do with the pressures of working in the third sector. We all love it, but we're also having to deal with an increasing amount of stress and increasing amount of workload. So it's about a recent report launched by the think tank Roger, and they've called it Caring Too Much. And quoted in Civil Society outlet, it goes on to say that the researchers found that many fundraisers cited repeated exposure to others' trauma and grief, whether from charity beneficiaries or donors, as a source of emotional strain. The feature goes on to say it identified 4 key drivers of stress and burnout among fundraisers, including their inherent empathy, which can be a source of emotional distress for many. The report says fundraisers' predisposition to put others and their organisation's needs before their own can also cause distress. It says fundraisers often feel pressure to achieve more for less, working under an assumption that they can deliver the impossible while simultaneously experiencing isolation. And writing in the reports forward, Roger chairman Damien Chapman described burnout as endemic in fundraising throughout the sector, adding it's a silent and devastating crisis in the fundraising profession. So there again, another quote that doesn't mince its words, but it's something that we see time and time again, Tim, whether it's within our own charities or whether we see it in reports that have been launched in the third sector, or whether we see it in the guests that we have on the show. So yeah, an ongoing problem without any concrete solutions, it seems, at the moment.
I think that's a really interesting conversation, and maybe we should try and see if we can persuade Damien to come onto the show to talk about it, because I think that's a really important conversation to be having, and what we can do and what charities can do to support their staff so that they don't suffer as a result of the good work that they do. I think that's a really important conversation to be having. So let's reach out to Damien, see if we can persuade him to come on. No pressure, Damien.
Before the news break, we talked to Matt Mahmood-Ogston about the issues charities face with their choice of imagery and some of the common traps they fall into in regard to campaign clichés. Now, in the second half of our conversation, we look at what charities can do to shift their approach, to think about imagery differently, and to break away from some of the things they may have relied on in the past.
Matt, do you feel that audiences have actually really moved on from the traditional imagery that charities use? And do you think that they still almost expect that kind of imagery, and therefore they respond to it accordingly and donate to charities accordingly? Or do you think that there's an appetite for change amongst audiences now in terms of the kind of things that they see coming from charities?
I think there's a huge fatigue in seeing the same old type of content. Like video, for example, it's incredibly important, but the sheer volume of video content that many of us consume on a daily basis, it means that it's very saturated and it's very easy to get lost in that noise if what you're doing is the same as what everyone else is doing. And what I'm seeing, what I'm focusing more on now is actually animated photo essays, which I actually learned from Magnum Voters, where you use photography as the medium. You animate it in like a slideshow. You put audio narration underneath. You put sound effects. You put music. So it's actually a video, but it's actually presented as a slideshow, because what it does is it encourages people to, this is the bit. I'm not used to seeing this type of content. Might not be for everybody. It'll be certainly not for us. Majority of people, perhaps, but for the people who we really want to connect on a much deeper level, having a photo, a single poignant photo, one frame for several seconds, for example, with music and audio playing in the background and a voiceover, that really encourages the user to really just focus on what's happening in that photo. And I'm actually seeing resurgence into black and white photography as well, because it's so much about colour. I mean, I love colour work. I spent all of lockdown working as a colourist on films. I love colour, but I've always loved black and white. And I'm thinking now that there's more of an appetite for exploring black and white again, because it interrupts the flow of people looking at the content, but perhaps sometimes it might get lower response rate because people don't know how to take it, they don't know how to process it. So it's an educational process of getting people back into the reasons why black and white photography in particular can actually create a more thoughtful response and engagement with the people who see it.
In a culture when people's attention spans are seconds and they swipe on quickly, it's stuff like that stands out, that could actually stop people from doing that makes them stop swiping for a second. Oh, that's different. So different is good, I think, in that sense, without a doubt. Sorry, Piers.
Well, it's also, it's also a very positive thing you're touching on there, Matt, because a lot of charities might be looking at the way and what we're talking about here and thinking, we don't know how to go through this. This is so overwhelming. Things are moving so quickly. How do we adapt? But what you're sort of saying is actually it's really positive, because then there are ways of looking at the way you present your imagery and your video and your storytelling that are already there, possibly. You're just using them in a more creative, more immediate, more responsive way to how people are consuming that kind of visual media anyway.
Exactly. It's black and white photography has been going around longer than color photography, but it's breaking that, interrupting that almost expectation or of seeing the content. If I ask you both, how many black and white videos or how many black and white photos have you seen within the last week on your social media, LinkedIn, Instagram? You probably have seen them, of course, but probably a lot less than you would of the color versions. And I think it's also important for charities to think about how you repurpose the same piece of content in multiple ways on multiple platforms that are relevant for your charity. So I see a lot of organizations, they think, okay, we've got to do a TikTok channel, we've got to do Instagram Reels, we've got to do LinkedIn video, we've got to do LinkedIn posts, we've got to do LinkedIn carousels, we've got to do Facebook posts, we've got to do, the list goes on. I've got to do email marketing, I've got to do website marketing. As a small charity, you'd like to think you can do all those. But what I found is when you focus on one platform as your primary one and just focus on that as your primary one, but then think about what platforms are actually really useful for us to engage with as a charity. Like I did some photos for Nishkam Swat, which is a Sikh charity that distributes food to the homeless in central London. I did a lot of work with them, and it's so interesting, their work. And one of the things they asked me to do was when you do the photographs for us, have this in mind that we want you to focus on between 7 and 9 images that can go in an exhibition within London somewhere that can actually highlight the current state of individuals who are homeless right now. And so they're already thinking about how do we use the work that you're doing for social media, for our funding application, for our website, how can we use it for physical events and physical activities where they can invite funders, grant makers, donors, supporters into a physical room. And I think people are not thinking enough about how do you reuse the content that you're already producing? How do you repurpose that to physical events? How do you, if you're shooting videos, how can you present one event, within London? Not just London, for anywhere, but London's London centric.
I think it's interesting also within the charity world. If you don't work within comms and you don't work within content every day, you're much less likely to have an appreciation of what the different options are for you in terms of storytelling. So it's interesting. What were your thoughts in terms of, as well as obviously storytelling for awareness purposes, in this world we have storytelling for fundraising purposes, and I'm sure there's plenty of income generation folks out there who'd say, we've tested different styles, we've tried all kinds of different approaches, but ultimately it's the emotive, tear-jerking photos, it's those traditional things that get results. Is there a way that we should be that they should be considering this differently and balancing ethical storytelling with practical fundraising that actually achieves the same goals as before? Is that education for them? What do you think?
There's all sorts of different ways. There is always going to be a place for very hard-hitting, emotionally driven storytelling. I use that quite a lot of the time in appropriate situations, but it's not. There's a certain amount of, say if the right word is fatigue in seeing those, because people become very. Once you get used to seeing very hard-hitting content, you become desensitized to it. So how do you engage with those people? How do you, for example, I've shared our story in it's been shared on we worked with Coronation Street a few years ago. It's been used on Coronation Street as an underline one of their big plot lines a few years ago. It's been turned into a song that's a folk song that's been performed in several countries around the world, and Glastonbury as well. It's about how do you share the same story as a news item, as an event, as a poem, as a monologue or an monologue. We're working on about abuse, so an monologue. How do you deliver it as a talk? How do you deliver it as a video? How do you deliver it as just a photography essay? And then think about who is it actually you're trying to engage with? So when we do funding applications, it's the same story, but we're touching upon very different things compared to speaking to these professionals. So the most important thing before actually doing any of the storytelling is really understanding who are you telling the stories to, and ultimately, what is the emotional response that you want that person to have when they see your content. So a month or so ago, I released a social impact storytelling formula, which really kind of breaks down this process. And one of the first things to do is think about what's the emotional response that you want the person to have when you see, hear, or touch your content. And if you don't get that, if you don't answer that question at the beginning, then how do you know which direction you're going into? Because first of all, you need to know where you are today, but then you need to know where you want to get to. It's like going to the shops. You can't say, I'm just going out to the shops to have no clue where the shops are or what shop you want to go to. You might eventually get there, but it will take you longer than if you just go to that shop over there. So it's the same for storytelling, as if I want to go into a room and I want to share a story, and I know that I want, for example, in a school, I might want anyone who is LGBT, I might want them to be able to trust the teachers for them to be able to go and speak to them if they're being bullied or see someone being bullied. It might be that if I go into a corporate environment where the audience, that has to be the most sanitized version of our story, for example, because people are typically listening in their lunch break, and we can't there's certain things we can't do when we talk in the corporate environment. So, but what is the thing that we want them to do? Do we want them to actually feel so emotionally connected that they donate at the end of listening to a talk or watching our story? Or do we want them just to go and go home and tell their family and tell their loved ones and tell their people in the community about something they've heard today? So if we don't know or don't understand or haven't done the work to understand that emotional trigger that we want, then it's very difficult to even know if you're successful or not, because what's the measure?
I think if you talk to a room full of charity comms professionals and content guys, you'd be preaching to the converted there. They would totally understand that. I think the challenge for charities is how you take other stakeholders on that journey with you. So how you take your income generation colleagues with you on that journey and give them the courage to sort of take that leap of faith, to try something different. So I think that's a challenge for a lot of organizations in terms of how you might think this is right, and the test and trial approach would be fantastic but how do you get your other colleagues, your other stakeholders to come on that journey with you? I think that's a challenge for a lot of organizations, perhaps. Could you share an example, Matt, of maybe a charity or a couple of charities that you think are doing this really well that others listening to this can go and take a look at?
Yeah, so one charity we work with quite a lot that do this really well, Carmen Ivana. Carmen Ivana are a charity up in the Leeds area. They operate the National Honour of Use Forced Marriage Helpline. And what they do exceptionally well is really sharing really powerful stories of individuals, particularly those who have sadly lost their life because of the abuse that they were experiencing, the honour-based abuse of the family. And they have something called a Survivor Ambassador Panel, and which I'm a member of. And they provide support, they offer engagement, and they provide opportunities for sharing stories to survivors of honour-based abuse. So they have a whole program which is primarily centered around bringing survivors together to empower each other through meeting other people who have been perhaps on a similar journey with each other, to talk to survivors and also victims, bring them together in a program, and then bringing them on board to offer them opportunities to share their story on the stage, to share their stories to the press, whatever appropriate opportunity, to appear in documentaries, to appear. They hold an event every year called the Day of Memory on the 14th of July, and that's a platform specifically for survivors to share their stories in a room full of detectives, social workers, frontline government officials, to give them the first-hand, the most rawest version of their story, unfiltered, in a room where people know that they're going to be truly impacted and affected by what they're hearing. And they use that to, in fact, I was with them yesterday actually because they're in the process of getting the government to agree to like a statutory definition of unabased abuse. So they do videos, they do podcasts, they do documentaries, they do public speaking, they do white papers, they do research papers, they do so many different storytelling in so many different ways. And I think that is, to me, one of the organizations that really, really do it right, because the rawness and integrity of every single person that shows their story is there. We understand how to tell it in different ways, on different platforms, to different audiences. So Karma Nirvana, Karma Nirvana, urge everyone to look them up on social media.
So getting to the authenticity, the emotional response, the emotional end goal, obviously is part of key of it. And so as well as just getting in touch with yourself, Matt, what advice would you give to charities who wanted to start to have a real look at their photography and their visual storytelling? Where would they start? What would be your one bit of advice for them to get this ball rolling?
I'd say the first thing is to understand the value of storytelling, to perhaps do a few searches about what storytelling is, look at some example videos on YouTube and different channels, and really understand that storytelling isn't writing a novel. It's not even writing a short story in quotes. It's just, how do you communicate something in a way that brings another person on board emotionally, in a way that allows people to feel or get to a destination that you want them to get to. In simple terms, that's really what a story is. There's loads of definitions, but ultimately it's not about, you don't need to be an author. I mean, I'm not an author, but you just need to understand a story could be one LinkedIn post with 500 characters. It could be a few sentences. I'd say that, if people look me up, if you look at my website, there is a free storytelling guide which people can download. It's completely free. That's a good place to start, because it goes through different frameworks that I've used to base my framework on. And really just ask yourself, what is it we want to achieve with our marketing, with the visibility of our charity? Because all charities have to justify the impact at the end of the year in their report. If they're receiving funding, they have to justify where their money's gone and explain where their money's gone and the impact they're having. So the need is there. Perhaps charities aren't using the word storytelling. I mean, we weren't for years, really. So I would say just look at the Story Brand Framework is a really good book to listen to or read on Amazon or Audible. It's incredibly great because it goes into a lot of detail about why the human connection is so important. But just don't be scared of sharing a story. It could be the story of the founder. It could be the story of the person who works on reception, why they come to work and why they do the work they do. It could be that you might not feel that you have access to anyone. So what do you need to do to have access to people who are willing to share their stories? So who's actually benefited from your work with your charity? There must be one person that you know that you think would be open to sharing their story. And then to get that person on board is letting them know what's the purpose and what's the benefit to the person sharing their story. What do they get out of it? Because ultimately you have to think about, there's a cost every time a service user shares their story. There's a cost attached to that, an emotional cost, a mental health cost, could be a financial cost. So where you can, look at ways of compensating that individual for their time. It could be all sorts of different, benefits that person could have from sharing their time, because I think it's so important for organizations not to take advantage of their users who are sharing their stories. And just yesterday, I was having a conversation with somebody about, they work in a charity space, the social impact space, and there's a constant expectation that because you work in a charity, for example, your time must be free. Organizations need to be really mindful of that. No, they work in a charity, but they are not a charity. You have to pay for their time, or as what our foundation does, a donation. You want my time? I can give you my time, but then you have to compensate our charity with funding that actually can help us do the work that you want me to talk about in your organisation.
Matt, thank you so much for joining us. It's been fantastic to chat. This has been a really fascinating discussion, and I think it's one that hopefully will get a lot of people thinking about how they approach storytelling differently. And how they do things differently going forward. So thank you so much for joining us. Before I let you go, tell us where our listeners could find out more about you, your work, about the Naz and Matt Foundation, and about this whole topic of ethical storytelling. Where can people find out more?
Thank you. So if you just Google my name, Matt Mahmood-Ogston, or if you look me up on my website is ogston.com, which is ogston.com. On there, you can see you can get access to the free storytelling guide that I talked about earlier. Naz and Matt Foundation. If you Google Naz, N-A-Z, and Matt Foundation, you'll see our website. You can learn more about our story, and you can see many of the different formats in which I've shared our story. And if you see something you like, please use it. Please use it to your own advantage. One of the most important things is that what I've learned and the struggles I've gone through to get to the stage where I am today, I don't want other people to go through all of those struggles. So if you see something, you see a format you like, use it, own it, run with it, do it for your own charity, because we're all here to support each other.
Matt, thank you so much, guys. We'll put all those links in the show notes as well. So we'll everyone who's interested can head to our show notes, and all the links will be there as well. But Matt, thank you ever so much for joining us today. It's been fantastic.
Amazing. Thank you so much. I hope you have a wonderful day ahead.
Now, in a new regular segment on the Charity Show, we're going to shine a spotlight on some of the UK's brilliant small charities. And with 96% of UK charities having an annual income of under £1 million, we've got plenty to choose from. So we want to hear your nominations. If you work for a small charity or you support one that you feel deserves a special mention, then let us know about it. You can email us at thecharityshowpod@gmail.com or use the links in the show notes to get in touch. Tell us what the charity is, where it is, who you support, what impact you make, and what your ambitions are. And if you're looking for any help from across the sector, then let us know and we'll share it for you. So then, Piers, to kick this new segment off, which charity are you going to spotlight this week?
Oh, we've got a great one to start with. This section is just wonderful to be able to highlight some of the smaller charities. We know them, the grassroots, the ones that are down your local town, your local area. There's so many of them up and down the country. And this is from Rachel from charity Open Country, who got in touch this week to tell us about the charity she works for. Open Country is a Yorkshire charity, she says, with 35 years of experience of working alongside disabled people, helping them to access and enjoy the countryside. They accomplish this through a variety of outdoor activities and the provision of information, training and advice for all. Now, Open Country has 400 disabled members, 170 volunteers, and runs 26 weekly outdoor activities. So in short, a fantastic small charity dedicated to making sure that everyone can enjoy time in the great outdoors. And you can see all of this for yourself on their website, which is opencountry.org.uk. So fantastic start to this new segment.
Open Country sounds amazing. I'll check it out. Fantastic stuff. So next up, we have, and Carol Thompson got in touch to tell us about an amazing charity called Sunny Cycles. Now, Sunny Cycles is a cycling charity based in Glasgow that enables people of all ages, abilities and backgrounds to participate in cycling and cycling activities. Now, Carol told us that the charity teaches adults and children to ride bikes and has bikes for people to use if they don't have their own. They also have a fleet of adapted bikes for people with disabilities to use so that they can cycle too. The charity's mission, Carol tells us, is to create an inclusive and welcoming community where people can experience the joy, freedom and health benefits of cycling. It does this through offering a variety of programs, including adaptive bike sessions, social rides and beginner-friendly cycling events, with a special focus on supporting individuals with disabilities, older adults and people from underserved areas. At Sunny Cycles, Carol says, we believe that everyone deserves a chance to ride, connect and enjoy Glasgow's great outdoors. So if you're in or around Glasgow and would like to access cycling activities, or you just like to find out more about the charity, then you can check them out at sunnycycles.org.uk.
A great pair of outdoorsy charities to kick off this new segment of the show there. And remember, you can nominate your small charity by emailing us at thecharityshowpod@gmail.com or heading to the show notes. And that's a wrap for episode 24. A huge thanks to Matt for giving us all food for thought when it comes to our use of images. And thanks also to our first nominated small charities, Open Country and Sunny Cycles. So what's coming next in the main show and on the Charity Show Bites, Tim?
Well, hold on to your hats because we're going to be diving back into the world of AI with past guests Zoe Amma and Dan Such, as they've set up a new AI task force for charities. So we'll be finding out all about that in the next main episode. And Piers and I will be back next Monday for another The Charity Show Bites. So keep an ear out for that one.
And don't forget, you can be part of the Charity Show too. Whatever your role in the third sector, send us your voice messages or get in touch through any of the links in the show notes to share your stories and let us know what topics you'd like us to cover.
And of course, as we've already mentioned, help us shine a spotlight on some great small UK charities. Head to the show notes to nominate your charity today.
In the meantime, please follow or subscribe on your usual podcast platform and leave us a 5-star review. It really helps more people find the show.
So that's it for episode 24. Thanks for listening, take care, and we'll see you soon.